As 2014 comes to an end, we see two of the world's largest countries preoccupied with developments inside their respective countries. Both the United States and China are confronting dissenters, angry demonstrators on the streets of their respective cities. In the case of the United States, this has been sparked off by the killing of young black males on two separate occasions within weeks of each other. In the case of China, it is the movement in Hong Kong, an old movement which has been struggling effectively for democracy and democratic rights. Let's start with the United States. We all know the story. It's been reported on virtually every television network in the world. A young black man on the streets of Ferguson in Missouri was shot dead after an altercation with a police officer. Now, what has created the anger, apart from the shooting, is the fact that the special jury convened to discuss whether or not the policeman who shot him dead should face trial, decided on the basis of flimsy and contradictory evidence not to charge the police officer. It is this failure of the judicial system in the case of a black male that has once again ignited a storm of protest throughout the United States. It's a protest which is going to carry on for some time. We've seen it before. It's come to a head now with the President of the United States finally making a tiny concession, saying that we have to find out how the communities of color fare at the hands of the police. But we don't need to find out. We already know what it is. There is something increasingly sick about liberal politics in the United States today. The early responses of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton to the events in Ferguson in Missouri are not surprising, but morally bankrupt. Clinton, the presidential contender for the Democrats, who thinks she's automatically going to be crowned as president and will enter the White House, has yet to comment on what happened. Why? The reason is obvious: political opportunism, can't afford to take sides, might lose votes. Say the right thing and she might lose white votes. Say the wrong thing and she might lose black votes. So better to remain silent. And though Obama has spoken up more recently, this graduate of the Chicago Law School's initial comments were to say that the system of justice was working fine. He could have added an earlier remark of his that he spoke in the euphoria of his victory, when he claimed, "We now live in a post-racial society," his election being proof of that, if any were needed. How grotesque these remarks sound now. So nothing to worry about then. Life will go on till the next young black is gunned down in the streets. In fact, it happened not long after Michael Brown was killed on the 9th of August 2014. The new death was in Cleveland, Ohio.
Black male, maybe 20, black revolver, black handgun.
The Las Vegas Review ran a series called Deadly Force, which started on November the 28th, 2011, 3 years ago. This Las Vegas Review wrote, "The nation's leading law enforcement agency, the FBI, collects vast amounts of information on crime nationwide, but missing from this clearinghouse are statistics on where, how often, and under what circumstances police use deadly force. In fact, no one anywhere comprehensively tracks the most significant act police can do in the line of duty: take a life. A new Counterpunch book, Killing Trayvon, contains a powerful essay by D. Brian Burghardt entitled Fatal Encounters. Burghardt provides us with a chilling picture of what happened. Early in the process, he writes, I estimated that about 1,000 individuals were killed by police every year since 2000. 14,000 deaths in 14 years seems like a lot. And I'll be honest, my original estimate is barely an educated guess. I arrived at it based on the numbers that came out of the Las Vegas Review-Journal series Deadly Force. By some rankings, Las Vegas is the 30th largest city in the United States. I simply assumed that Las Vegas's average of 7 deaths per year was the average for the top 60 cities in the country, and that police were more likely to use deadly force in those 60 bigger cities than in smaller towns, where police are more likely to know the people they interact with. It's conjecture. In July 2012, the Malcolm X grassroots movement released a critical report exposing the fact that in the first 6 months of the year, a black man, woman, or child was summarily executed by the police, and a smaller number of security guards and self-appointed vigilantes. Every 36 hours. But the July 2012 report doesn't tell the whole story. And true to form, the assault on black life stayed consistent for the last 6 months of the year, resulting in the extrajudicial killing of at least 313 black people in 2012, or 1 every 28 hours. Now, these are astonishing figures, but we shouldn't be surprised, because this tradition of targeting and killing blacks has been going on in the United States for a very long time. For a while, it was held at bay by the growth of a mass civil rights movement, for whom Dr. Martin Luther King was one of the representatives, and others included Stokely Carmichael and, of course, the great Malcolm X. They used to point out all these things that were going on in the black communities. They used to point these out to the press, to the media. Sometimes notice was taken and sometimes not, but they were there fighting. It is with the decline of the black movement as a political movement in the United States that these things effectively are not creating the results they should, which is anger on the part of ordinary Americans, especially liberal Americans, but not just them, saying enough and no more, that this shouldn't go on, that this has been going on too long. But Ferguson, Missouri, Cleveland, Ohio, Florida, where Trayvon was brutally killed by a vigilante, and the guy who killed him was acquitted. These things will go on unless something is done at the level of the justice system. If you look at the account in Ferguson given by the police officer who shot Brown dead, it's riddled with inconsistencies of one sort or another, not least in his description of an 18-year-old black kid about to go to college who's already pinched a packet of cigarettes from a shop, should be running away. The claim of the officer is that the kid actually started beating him up, and when he turned around, he saw the most aggressive face he had ever seen in his life. Given the history of relations between the American police and black people, this on its own sounds a bit unlikely. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying it didn't happen. We don't know. We would have found out had there been a trial. But the American justice system, in this case, led by a very aggressive attorney general, made sure that that didn't happen. So what is the outcome of this? Things will carry on like this. And in the election campaign, which is going to come up first with the primaries, very few people will actually raise these questions at all, because they are unsettling questions to ask why nearly centuries after the Civil War, this is still going on, that black people don't have their rights, that on average the black family has much less wealth than their white counterparts. I mean, poor white counterparts. I don't talk about the rich. All the figures point out to economic deprivation. And the question we have to ask is this: how come that the richest, most powerful state in the world still cannot come to terms with the fact that black people are unequal? We know the incarceration figures in the United States. There is a disproportionately high level of young blacks locked up in the American prison system than at any other time in American history. In fact, the figures are quite astonishing, that there are the same number of black people going through the prison system of the United States now, in different levels, prisoners on parole, having to report back, etc., the same number of people as the number of slaves that existed in the United States before the Civil War. Now that's a figure to think about, and for American politicians to at least refer to and ask, how come we can't do anything about it? From Ferguson, Missouri, to Hong Kong, China. Completely different environments, different parts of the world, different cultures, different traditions, and yet the Chinese state now finds itself in a confrontation with sections of its own population in Hong Kong. Important to see what Hong Kong is, why it has become the focus of this dispute, and how this dispute can be resolved. And contrary to some foolish commentators, in my opinion, it's not just about money, that they have less money than the mainland. It's more serious than that. This is a case of young people, and not just young people, asserting their rights. Hong Kong was seized from China in 3 separate stages during the 19th century. The original occupation was designed to assist Britain's main economic activity in the area, the opium trade. Just over a century later, under British colonial rule, there were 300,000 hard drug addicts, 80,000 triad gang members, several 100,000 squatters, sickness and squalor all round. The post boxes were red, it was hot and could turn humid, the policemen wore short trousers, a few well-known firms dominated the economy. Where could this be? No doubt about it, a British colony. It's terrible conditions. Millions lived in poverty on starvation wages. Its completely undemocratic constitution were known to all. There was no democracy in Hong Kong under British rule. My own experience attests to this. In 1973 or 74, I can't exactly remember, I went to see a Chinese dissident from the mainland who was living in Macau. Had been living there since the 50s. He was desperate to get out. I went to see him to see how we could get him out of Macau into Britain as a refugee. And we succeeded on that. But on my return from Macau to Hong Kong on the hydrofoil, I was arrested by the Hong Kong police and expelled. They gave no reasons. Despite the fact I had a British passport, I had no rights in Hong Kong whatsoever. I was treated politely, But many people who live there, Chinese people, trying to set up trade unions, trying to set up political parties, trying to improve their living conditions, were dealt with quite brutally. The methods of interrogation in Hong Kong prisons during British colonial rule were pretty nasty and unpleasant. Let's fast forward now a decade or so. In 1989, there were massive mobilizations in the then British colony of Hong Kong in support of the Tiananmen Square protesters in China. As everyone knows, the protests in China on the mainland, the occupation of Tiananmen Square, the reason for it was very clear, that they wanted the fifth modernization. Deng Xiaoping, the supreme leader, had promised 4 modernizations, largely social and economic. The students said, we want a 5th modernization, democracy. And their numbers grew and grew and grew. There were debates within the student movement at the time, and they decided to have a show of strength, and the Chinese army, used against its own people for the first time, crushed them brutally. Since that time, the Chinese Communist Party has been careful, especially careful in relation to Hong Kong, and concerned by the possibility that Hong Kong, under the system of one country, 2 systems, they were worried that this arrangement might become a weak link in its authoritarian rule. Now, I think it's important to understand that at the time of the British departure, informal arrangements were made between the British and the Chinese government, which saw guarantees being given that the way of life in Hong Kong would more or less remain the same. The South China Press, other newspapers that came out wouldn't be touched. And so for a while, Hong Kong continued to have a slightly different system, in the sense you had publishing houses, you had dissidents agitating for civil rights. I met some of them when I visited Hong Kong at the time, and it seemed quite a liberated area, using the vacuum created by the British departure and the Chinese entry to try and create something new. Since the 1980s, when negotiations for the handover began, Beijing repeatedly promised that the Chief Executive and Legislative Council, LegCo, of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region would eventually be elected locally through universal suffrage. But in practice, Beijing sought to perpetuate the oligarchic political structure left behind by the British. It found ready allies in the Hong Kong business elite, who enjoyed privileged access to political power since colonial times. They carried on like that. In the early summer of 2010, something quite astonishing happened. Beijing and the Hong Kong Democratic Party, the leading local democratic movement since the 1990s, which the Chinese Communist Party still designates officially a subversive organization because of its leader's active role in 1989 in defense of Tiananmen, but they reached an agreement that surprised everyone. For the first time ever, it was agreed to increase the proportion of popularly elected seats in the 2012 LegCo election to more than 50%. Confusion and speculation abounded as to what motivated Beijing to make such a concession, or whether it was a real concession at all. To make sense of this slightly puzzling development, and to draw out the implications for the future of Hong Kong's political system, we need to take into consideration the mounting class tensions since the 1997 handover, the radicalization of the democratic movement in Hong Kong, And in this light, Beijing's gesture appeared as a pragmatic attempt to contain brewing class and generational struggles, for it understood very well that a large-scale political turmoil in Hong Kong might spill over and destabilize the political order in mainland China. Such turmoil would also jeopardize, and this is extremely important to understand, it would jeopardize Beijing's plans to turn Hong Kong into a showcase for what awaits Taiwan as a stable offshore financial market facilitating the internationalization of the renminbi. These hopes came to an end in June this year, 2014. When Beijing published its white paper, the agreed deal had been unceremoniously discarded. The Politburo wanted an approved list of candidates for the 2017 elections. It is this that lies at the origin of the protests that have been going on since September. The aim of the demonstrators was very straightforward: to restore the democratic rights that had been promised by Beijing and more. They were completely non-violent, as their organizational name suggests, Occupy Central with love and peace. It was the Hong Kong authorities, frustrated by the mass support achieved by the demonstrators and the strictly constitutional way in which they were marching on the streets and occupying various centers, that they decided to embark on violence. That is, the authorities did, not the demonstrators. It was the police that used masked people, reportedly from the Triad, to break into Legco, the Hong Kong Parliament, in a crude attempt to discredit the protesters. It failed. And then, one day, the new would-be supreme leader of China, successor to Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, declared that the demonstrations were illegal. Fatal word. Because in China, when something is declared illegal, it means that the state is going to repress it, and if the demonstrators carry on, increasing violence will be used against them. Now, it's obvious that Xi does not want a repeat of Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong. That event has still not been completely deleted from the historical memory of Chinese intellectuals at home and abroad. Xi is hoping that via mild repression and silence, the protests will ultimately run out of steam. He's keen to do politics the Western way. The US today is not a particularly good model. Europe, too, is getting worse. Random arrests, demonstrators tear-gassed, demonstrations being declared illegal. Nobody, till now, has been killed in Hong Kong, and that's a relief. C.Y. Leung, Hong Kong's chief executive, tells friendly Westerners that democratic elections would put populists in power. Now, this is a very interesting concept. The word populism, which has a specific meaning, is being used increasingly to frighten the West, that if you force us on this, you can't anyway, but why bother trying? Because populism, the word, means someone who is anti-capitalist and who is determined to do something to improve the conditions of the poor. All the South American leaders from Hugo Chavez onwards, who have been elected in different parts of the continent and who are doing something for the poor, are denounced as populists. So the function of not permitting elections and going back on the deal that Beijing had offered was nothing to do with populism. It was to preserve the monopoly of power, not allow that to be challenged. Why? A fifth of Hong Kong's 7 million people live in poverty. The income gap is the widest in the developed world. The richest 10% of the Hong Kong population now controls 77.5% of the wealth, according to Credit Suisse research, up from 69.3% in 2007. And the figures in the mainland, by the way, while not the same as Hong Kong, are also pretty high. China as a country now has the largest disparities in income between the rich and the poor. And the country is still led by a party which calls itself the Chinese Communist Party. House prices in Hong Kong have soared, making them the most expensive in the world. So what they are frightened of is if they permit even 50% of the Hong Kong Parliament to be elected, it's bound to result in dissidents, socialists, people who think broadly, coming in and using Parliament as a forum to denounce what is going on in terms of the social and economic conditions in Hong Kong. And most importantly, if you permit this in Hong Kong, young people on the mainland will say, if Hong Kong can have its own parliament elected, half of it elected, why not Beijing? Why not Shanghai? Why not Canton? Why not Xinjiang? Why not other parts of China? And the fact that the mainlanders are noticing this and talking about it, or writing about it on the internet, exchanging communications, we know now that up to 100 internet users discussing these things have been locked up in China. So the fear of losing their monopoly is one of the biggest fears that haunts the Chinese leadership. They could, of course, set up a democracy like the United States, have two parties which believe in the same thing. But what comes with that is while you retain power or share power with another faction or clique, essentially what happens is that you also have to permit some freedom of the press, some freedom of movement, etc. One of the leaders of the revolt in Hong Kong, Joshua Wong, 17 years old, recently told an American newspaper what they believed in. This is what he said. The post-90s generation is growing up in a vastly changed city from that of our parents and grandparents. Earlier generations, many of whom came here from mainland China, wanted one thing: a stable life. A secure job was always more important than politics. They worked hard and didn't ask for much more than some comfort and stability. The people of my generation want more in a world where ideas and ideals flow freely. We want what everybody else in an advanced society seems to have: a say in our future. Our bleak economic situation contributes to our frustrations. Job prospects are depressing. Rents and real estate are beyond most young people's means. The city's wealth gap is cavernous. My generation could be the first in Hong Kong to be worse off than our parents were. Here you have it in a nutshell. More accountability, more representation, more social equality. Simple. That is what people all over the world are demanding.